فكلي واشربي وقري عينا فإما ترين من البشر أحدا فقولي إني نذرت للرحمن صوما.
Hey everyone, Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to the Islamic Mary podcast. So for today, I want to speak about Ramadan. So Ramadan is coming up closely in the next couple of weeks, and Ramadan is a month of fasting. So oftentimes when Muslims think about Ramadan, you think of sawm or siyam and the idea of abstaining from food and drink. So I think the story of Maryam actually allows us to think about fasting in a more deep and profound way, because the word sawm is used in Surah Maryam and is used directly when speaking about Maryam. So traditionally, when you think about sawm literally means to abstain, and it's connected to the month of Ramadan. So if you look at various verses in the Quran, for example, in 2:183, it says, "You who believe, fasting is prescribed for you, I will prescribe for those before you, so that you may be mindful of God. Fast for a specific number of days, but if one of you is ill or on a journey, he should fast on other days later." So here is the famous verse in the Quran that speaks about fasting and prescribing the month of Ramadan. As it mentions in the verse, Ramadan is a month of fasting. It's a month of siyam, and it's to understand and be mindful of God. So it's not simply about the food and the desserts and not eating, but the idea is to be conscious of God in your daily life, and that trickle down to the rest of your life, even outside of Ramadan. Makes clear that you're supposed to fast for a specific number of days, the month of Ramadan. It's not something Muslims are supposed to do throughout the entire year, but it's a reserved month that changes every single year based on the lunar calendar. But there's an exception. If you're ill, if you're on a journey, then you're allowed to fast other days. So this is not supposed to be something of a hardship, but rather this is something supposed to be easy and for people who are able to fast. So we see in the Arabic here, it says, Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu kutibu alaykumus siyam. So here it's emphasizing the idea of literally writing or prescribing, decreeing this idea of siyam upon all of you. Kama kutiba ala alladhina min qablikum. So this is something that other people before you have done, such as Christians or Jews and other religions, that there is this idea of abstaining, of fasting. Many of my Christian students talk about Lent. For Jews, they have the idea of Yom Kippur and the idea of fasting as well, of the Sabbath, of abstaining from technology and work. So this idea of fasting is not necessarily unique to Islam, even though the month of Ramadan may be لَعَلَّكُمْ تَتَّقُونَ. So you may be mindful and conscious of God. Now, oftentimes when we think about Siyam or fasting over the month of Ramadan, you don't necessarily hear stories about it connected to biblical and Quranic figures. So oftentimes there is a move to go to the fiqh of fasting, or how do you fast? What's the proper way to fast? And the idea of taqwa, of being conscious of God. But when I started to write on the Quran and the Bible, I found that the idea of fasting is connected to the stories of the prophets, that there isn't this strong division between the idea of fiqh, of the idea of sharia, of law, of understanding of religious practice, and the idea and the concept of stories. So we see that there is Maryam's fast. So in this chapter of Maryam, after she gives birth to Jesus, Isa, she's told, "And say to anyone you may see, I have vowed to the Lord of mercy to fast, sawm, from conversation, and I will not talk to anyone today." So the Arabic says clearly to her that when she's in the state of pain, فَكُلِي وَاشْرَبِي وَقَرِّي عَيْنًا. So eat, drink, and have your heart at ease. But if you see any people, then tell them that you've made a vow of silence. فَلَنْ أُكَلِّمَ الْيَوْمَ إِنْسِيًّا, and that you will not speak to anyone today. So Maryam is supposed to engage in this vow of silence, which may be similar to earlier in the chapter of Zechariah, who's told also not to speak for 3 days and 3 nights. Now, this is fascinating because Maryam just had a child, and everyone, including herself, knows that she's never touched a man. She hasn't been married. She's not even necessarily engaged in the Quranic and the Islamic story. So how is she supposed to go to her people with this child and not speak and not be able to defend herself? So we see that Maryam is told not to speak and do a fast, not necessarily that of food and drink, but that of silence. So this actually sets up the speech of Jesus, of Isa. So when she goes back to her people, they begin to ask her questions and say, Maryam, we know you're a good person, you come from a good family. How could you have done such a horrendous thing? And then what she does is she points to the child, فَأَشَارَتْ إِلَيْهِ. And then they exclaim to her, كَيْفَ نُكَلِّمُ مَنْ كَانَ فِي الْمَهْدِ صَبِيًّا. How are you supposed to speak to someone who's an infant in the cradle? They're shocked and dismayed that she's suggesting to them that they should not ask her, but that of the child. Now, what happens is that Jesus begins to speak, and then he defends his mother. So the fact that Maryam is silent leads the way to the speech of her son, of Isa. This, in many ways, demonstrates the idea of silence actually allows for the speech of others. And sometimes the speech of others in your community or even your families may be better and more appropriate within a particular context. And we see this theme of silence throughout the Quran, that the believers are often told to be silent. They're not supposed to respond to their distractors, and they're supposed to focus on their goal and mission. So a famous Quranic verse says, عِبَادُ الرَّحْمَنِ الَّذِينَ يَمْشُونَ عَلَى الْأَرْضِ هَوْنًا. So the true servants of the most compassionate of God are those who walk on the earth humbly. وَإِذَا خَاطَبَهُمُ الْجَاهِلُونَ قَالُوا سَلَامًا. And when the foolish address them improperly, they only respond with peace. So when people, especially the ignorant, are attacking you or calling you names, when they're undermining your credibility, here they're told to be silent, just to simply say peace, that they're not supposed to respond to them, attack them, retaliate, but rather to continue to walk on the earth in peace and humility. Now, this is important because we see this idea of the fasting of the tongue, sawm al-lisan. And this idea of fasting of the tongue is found within various literature, especially mystical and even Sufi literature. You find this in the famous book, Ihya Ulumuddin, the revival of the Islamic sciences by Abu Hamid al-Ghazali. And this book tries to go to the inner, deeper understandings of the faith. Oftentimes, we look at our faith, we look at faith and Islam and religion as a set of rules. You're supposed to do this, you're supposed to fast, you're supposed to pray, you're supposed to go on the Hajj, and if you don't do this correctly, you could be in a state of sin, eventually go to hell. But one of the things that Imam Ghazali does in this book is try to find the inner meanings of the various rituals. Why do we perform these religious rituals? What is their purpose? What are their spiritual benefit? And in the book, he talks about fasting, and he talks about 3 different levels of fasting. He explains that fasting of the masses is to prevent one's stomach and private parts from fulfilling its desires. So the general understanding of fasting is not to engage in food, drink, and sexual desire. This is the basic understanding that most people have of fasting, and many Muslims, maybe even the majority or overwhelming majority, engage in fasting in the month of Ramadan. That they, on the most basic level, do not eat, drink, and engage in sexual relations. However, for the fast of the spiritual elite is to prevent one's hearing, seeing, tongue, hand, feet, and all the limbs from sin. So here you see a deeper understanding of fasting, which is connected to the literal meaning of siyam, which is to abstain. So for a higher level, it's for someone to prevent themselves from engaging in sin or things that may be unbeneficial and productive for a person, whether that's what they hear, they see, they taste, their touch, and every single limb from something that would lead to the displeasure of God. And then he later explains that fasting of the spiritual elite is to avoid speaking ill, such as engaging in lying, backbiting, and that it's incumbent to be silent and preoccupy oneself with remembering God and reciting the Quran, for that is a fasting of the tongue. So here, it's not simply about food and drink, but rather there's this idea of sawm al-lisan, that you should abstain from speaking bad about people, saying things that are not true, and there's benefits to being silent, just like Maryam, who was silent when she was being accused and being attacked. And rather than simply responding and always talking and going through social media feeds, it may be better to preoccupy oneself with remembering God and reciting the Quran, to be in a state of reflection, a meditation, a sense of trying to understand who you are in relationship with those around you and the world. So silence actually is beneficial. It's something that sometimes is criticized within our cultures, that someone doesn't have the courage to speak. But in fact, silence could lead to greater understanding of yourself and to deeper reflections. And we see that there are many prophetic traditions that speak to this idea of fasting and the idea of silence. So one famous prophetic tradition that Imam Ghazali and others, they cite, and they say how many of those who fast don't get anything out of their fast except hunger and thirst. So the idea of this prophetic tradition is that people often fast. Maybe the majority or overwhelming majority of Muslims fast. But do they benefit anything out of it spiritually? Is it something of simply starvation? Or are you really abstaining for a higher purpose of trying to get closer to God and become a better person? And one of the interpretation of this tradition is the person prevents themselves from eating permissible food, but then breaks their fast on the meat of people through backbiting, which is impermissible. So Imam Ghazali here is making the point that people sometimes will fulfill the ritual. They will go through the checklist and say, oh, I didn't eat, I didn't drink. But then when they break their fast, they are engaging in sin. They are engaging in lying and cheating and backbiting, and they didn't necessarily benefit from this fast, and it didn't necessarily lead to them becoming better people. So we also see there's a prophetic tradition that says, whoever believes in God and the end of days, let them say something that's good or be silent. So there is this idea of speaking, that someone as a Muslim or as a religious person, they should not simply be silent all the time. There are many verses that talk about the idea of saying what is true, speaking up, fighting against tyranny and injustice. But there are also verses that speak about the importance of silence, that someone doesn't have to speak all the time, that there may be times and contexts where it's better to be silent and to go in a moment of reflection and of contemplation. So to conclude, we see there's a new meaning of fasting. For many Muslims and people even who understand or learned or taught about Islam, the idea of fasting is connected to the ritual. It's connected to the month of Ramadan, that someone is not supposed to eat or drink or engage in sexual relations from the morning to the evening, that during daylight hours, Muslims are in a state of fasting. But when we look at how the word is actually used in the chapter of Maryam, we get back to what it's really about. And it's really the idea of abstaining. And abstaining doesn't necessarily have to be only with that of food. It could be of speaking or abstaining from doing something that's wrong or incorrect. And that there's a relationship between fasting and silence. That Maryam, when she has Jesus, Isa, she's told to take this vow of silence. And if anyone speaks to her, she should be quiet and not respond. This actually leads to the speech of Jesus, of Isa. And that Isa is able to speak, define who he is, and defend his mother. And we see that in this idea of abstaining and of sawm al-lisan, that people have the opportunity to focus on what they're saying and to really think, is what I'm saying positive, beneficial, productive? Is it something that is good and is helping myself and those people around me? Or is it leading to friction, conflict, lying, backbiting? Is it creating discord within myself and within my community? And it leads to this idea that sawm, or siyam, and the idea of Ramadan is not simply a month, it's not simply a set of rituals, but rather it is a spiritual practice. And it is a spiritual practice that can be implemented throughout the year and lead to someone to become a more wholesome and better person. Thanks so much for listening once again to the Islamic Mary podcast. I'll encourage you to subscribe. You can also encourage others to listen to this podcast. I've been using this podcast in my classes on the Quran and Bible and also the stories of the prophets. I'll also encourage you to go to my website where you can see my recent blogs and academic writings, and to join my listserv where I'll be updating you on the publication of my forthcoming book, The Islamic Mary. I'm happy that I recently got the proofs of the book. I'm going through it, making some minor changes, trying to get folks to write blurbs for the book, and then hopefully it should be out in fall 2025. Thanks once again, and take care.